Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to our Elite Deep Dive series. If you missed it, last week I started doing a series where I go through and cover the details and parameters of the weekly Elite Deep Dive to help give you guys some tips and tricks on how to get through them as efficiently as possible and help you understand them a little bit better. So without further ado, let's get right into the video and talk about this week's Elite Deep Dive, Bitter N. So going into the details of the dive bit by bit, first talking about the biome that it takes place in, we have the fungus bogs this week. The fungus bogs is my personal least favorite biome in the entire game. It has the most annoying hazards and is just a general pain to go through. However, thanks to the generation this particular week, it's not actually the worst thing in the world to go through. There are some situations where you have a lot of those explosive plants that can be problematic, and there are, of course, some of those poison gas spewing plants, as well as the sludge that coats the floor that make it hard for you to move around. But thankfully, not too many things are directly in your way, and it's not the most obtrusive generation that they could have thrown at you, so it's actually not too bad. There were a couple situations where if we were not careful, the explosive plants would have taken us out, but thankfully we just took it very slow, and it wasn't that big of a deal. Also, if you're looking for a specific drink take on this particular Elite Deep Dive, I would say again, Red Rock Blaster is a good one, but also Backbreaker Stout because you're going to be carrying a lot of things, and Rocky Mountain Ale is also a good choice because you're going to be cutting through terrain a decent amount in order to get to the particular objectives. So now going into the actual stage detail of the particular dive in terms of what objectives you're going to have to do. For this week, there is a very big focus on salvage operation objectives, which is interesting. In stage 1, you are going to have to do a salvage operation where you collect 3 mini mules, as well as collect 150 Morkite. And you will also have the duck and cover modifier active on this, so there's going to be a lot more ranged enemies. In stage 2, you're going to have to collect 4 eggs and then again repair 2 more mini mules. And you will also have the Macterra Plague active during this particular stage. And in stage 3, you are going to again have a salvage operation where you collect 2 mini mules, and then you will have to find 2 different crystals for a deep scan. And there will be no warning or anomaly on this particular stage. Now, even though I say there's no warning or anomaly, at least when my group went through this, we found that there was still a ton of Macterra and ranged enemies on this last stage. So I'm not sure if for some reason maybe just the coding of the first 2 warnings just kind of bled over and we still had a lot more left over Macterra enemies, but there was still a lot of flyers and ranged enemies on the last stage. So keep that in mind that you will still probably have to deal with them. So as you can tell, there is a big theme on defense in this particular week's deep dive. There are a lot of holdout points, there are a lot of swarms that are going to hit you, and there are going to be a ton of flying enemies throughout the course of the entire run, as well as very powerful ranged enemies such as septic spreaders or menaces or spitballers. So strong defense and very strong flying control is going to be paramount, which I'll go into a little bit more when I talk about class loadouts. So now talking about the cave generations for each individual stage and how they work out. For the most part, they're relatively straightforward this particular week's deep dive. There aren't too many crazy things that you need to be aware of. Thankfully, as all of the objectives focus on a big open room with a lot of different places that you can hold out in, there's not too much confusion going on in terms of where you need to go. In stage 1, it is a very short initial walk to get to the main room, and in that main room, at least for us, we had a ton of spitballers as well as a couple scale brambles, so you want to be very careful about where you go. Interestingly enough, the large mushrooms that you can find in this particular room can actually work well at giving you cover from the scale brambles or the spitball infectors depending on where you are. Once you're able to take them all out, the room is pretty open and there's not too many crazy places that you can go. Thankfully, all the Morkite seems to be grouped up in the same general area, so it's not too difficult to collect all the Morkite that you need in order to complete the objectives. For the holdout sections, we got very lucky, especially when it came to the refueling stage, because the fuel pod landed in a very easily defendable spot where the enemies can only get to us from one point. You might have a slightly different generation than we did, but even throughout the course of the cave, there were many good defendable locations. In stage 2, it kind of had a bit of a weird sort of winding spiral layout that went up and down. Thankfully, all of the eggs and the mules are in one area, and if you follow the main path, it will basically take you to that room. And the room itself is not incredibly large, so you actually have a good spot to hold out in. Since you are doing an egg mission, you are going to have to handle at least one swarm that's going to hit you, provided you don't get hit with a random swarm that also happens to get you at the same time. And then finally in stage 3, it is a very large open room with a very short walk towards it. Since you need to collect resonance crystals, one of them is literally on the way to the main room, so you can knock out that objective very quickly. And keep in mind that once you do uncover the resonance crystal, that will spawn enemies for you to take out. So try not to hit them too quick between each other, otherwise you are going to get swarmed really quickly. And while that didn't necessarily happened to us, we did have kind of a close call where a team wipe nearly happened because we weren't really keeping track of everything that was going on. But thankfully, Iron Will clutched and saved the day, which who's surprised at that? Aside from that, the holdout points that we got were okay. They weren't really the best or most practical, but we were able to make do with what we had thanks to everybody's setups. Next, going into some good class loadouts that you can use for this particular elite deep dive. For me, this week I went through it with Gunner because I felt as though he was very well equipped to deal with the ranged and flying enemies, and I was mostly right. My perk setup that I was using was Dash and Field Medic, and my passive perks were Resupplier, Born Ready, and Sweet Tooth to help keep me alive as well as keep my weapons topped up, especially with the particular weapon setup that I am using. And the build that I was using was a very aggressive build using Big Bertha for the Thunderhead and a Hellfire coil gun that handled everything pretty well. The amount of splash damage that I had with it really helped to break up the groups of ranged enemies and keep them locked down, and handling the flying enemies in stages 2 and 3 was actually quite easy as well. If you wanted to go with something like the Hurricane to help you out more with those flying enemies, you could go with that as well. But this build worked out for me throughout pretty much the entirety of the run. The only real thing you have to be careful about is hitting your teammates, which thankfully wasn't too much of an issue during this particular run. Now, instead of having specific tips for each individual stage, I think it's better to just have overarching tips for each class throughout the course of the entire dive, because there really wasn't anything that stood out within each individual stage depending on what situation you were in. For the Gunner specifically, he really only has one tip that you need for the entire dive. Be generous with your shield. I cannot overstate how important it was to use the shield during this particular dive. With the ranged enemies in stage 1, with the flying enemies in stage 2, and the combination of both of them in stage 3, the shield for the Gunner was beyond valuable and saved me so many times throughout the course of this run. Do not hesitate to use the shield if you see several enemies closing in on you. If you're worried about running out of shields, you don't have to worry too much, because again, since there are so many mini mules and salvage objectives during this particular dive, you are going to get a lot of nitro throughout the course of the run, which means you have the ability to be incredibly proactive with your shield, which can save the team in many different situations, especially since you again have several different holdout points that you need to survive through. In the first and third stage, since they are both salvage operation missions, the best thing to do first is to just try to find the most problematic enemies to clear out, and then prep yourself for the eventual defense stages, where again, as I said before, use your shield often because enemies are not going to give you a chance to breathe. And then in the second stage, it kind of follows the same sort of theme. You're only going to have to handle one real swarm with the egg swarm that happens, and otherwise use your zip lines to help your allies or yourself get to various locations. Talking about the other classes now, first starting off with the Engineer, since you are up against a lot of flying and ranged enemies, you want a build that has high accuracy and some good crowd control. An explosive chemical round smart rifle would be really good comboed up with a shard diffractor with anything like efficiency tweaks or overdrive booster, and the SSGs would really help out control the swarms as well. Essentially, you want to be able to just pick out those problematic flying enemies or be able to have good burst damage to take out groups of enemies if needed. And since you want to be able to hold a good angle because there's a lot of ranged enemies, you want to be able to have good range as well. So things like the smart rifle or the shard diffractor would work very well. In the first stage, you basically just really want to focus on finding the good Morkite spots that need a platform for your scout and setting them up for them. Thankfully, the Morkite, as I said, is pretty close together, so you don't need to work too hard to collect them. And then you need to make sure that your sentries are in good positions during the actual defense stage. Again, I would recommend using the double sentry during this particular dive because you have multiple different holdout sections. You can get away with running a single sentry if you really want to, but just with the sheer number of enemies that are going to be coming at you throughout the course of this dive, the double sentries are probably going to work better. For the second stage, again, since all the eggs and mini mules are in the same general area towards the end of the cave, it sets up a very good spot for you to be able to place your sentry guns and set up a foothold for your teammates to fall back to. You can also have your driller set up a bunker for you in a defendable location for when those swarms eventually happen. And then lastly, in stage 3, it's very similar to stage 1, albeit in a much larger room. Again, the same sort of premise applies, although you don't have to worry about Morkite on this particular stage. So essentially all you need to do is help your scout get to any leftover minerals that you still want to collect, or help the rest of your teammates collect the mini mule eggs, and then set up for the eventual defense stages. Now, the scout is in an interesting position since you actually get a lot of nitro from this week's dive thanks to all the mini mules. You don't have to be as aggressive when it comes to gathering resources and can focus more on fighting and add clear. Of course, you still should take the opportunity to grab nitro and resources whenever possible, but you do have a lot more leeway in this week's dive, and a good high-value target build can be very effective, since a stray septic spreader or spitballer can cause massive damage and mess with your team. A hipster M1000 build setup with a jumbo shells boomstick Stick can work really well, as it allows you to melt enemies relatively effectively and handle those high-value targets quickly. And these stun sweepers were incredibly powerful throughout the course of this run, as they can stun lock essentially entire swarms, making the flyers and the spitter swarms that you're going to have to deal with much more easier. And again, like the gunner, there aren't really any stage-specific tips needed for the scout, other than just to keep an eye out for problematic enemies tucked away in a corner, and also to gather resources. Look out for septic spreaders hiding over corners or menaces popping up all over the place, and focus them down as quick as possible, because that is going to be the main thing that takes your team out if you're not being careful. Then finally, for the driller, it is highly recommended that you take a cryo build on this particular dive. It can grind entire swarms to a halt, and the Mactera issue that you have in the last 2 stages are made trivial with a strong cryo build. Cryo cannon with something like Tuned Cooler or Snowball will devastate anything in the air, which, as I said, is a lot of this dive. And honestly, the rest of the build, you can kind of use whatever you want. You can use whichever secondary you want. You can use whichever throwing weapon you want, although I would probably say the impact axis would work best if you are running a cryo build. And in stage 1, you really want to focus on just getting good spots for your allies to hold out during the uplink and fueling stages. Again, we got a really good drop for the fueling stage defense, which made it really easy, but you might have a bit of a different generation, so you might have to adjust accordingly. In stage 2, mainly you just need to help the team navigate quickly and prep for the inevitable egg swarms that are bound to happen, and focus on the flyers as much as you can, since again, if you're running cryo, you're going to be the best equipped to handle them. And then in stage 3, it's very similar to stage 1, again, since it is the same basic mission type. You just need to set up good defense points for your allies to be able to hold out during the uplink and the refueling stages. And since you have your drills, you are able to find the resonance crystals relatively quickly and set up good points in order to connect the scanners. So all in all, this deep dive is not the worst in the world. The fact that it has both Duck and Cover and Mactera Swarm honestly scared me a little bit, because those are 2 very problematic mutators to have, especially at high levels. But thankfully, we were able to handle them very well. And again, keep in mind that the setups that I gave you for each individual class are just my personal suggestions. And if you have a build that handles ranged or Mactera enemies even better than these, by all means, go ahead and use them. These were just my suggestions. And again, remember that above all else, going through an elite deep dive is all about coordination and cooperation between your teammates. It's not meant to be something that you go through by yourself or that you're able to one-man army. It is meant to be a collective effort that you and your team work together to complete. Hopefully now you guys are a little bit better equipped to handle this week's Elite Deep Dive, and let me know down in the comments if you did clear it, and if so, what was the craziest thing that happened? And if you have any other tips for this week's Elite Deep Dive, or just Elite Deep Dives in general, be sure to also put those down in the comments to help everyone out. Anyway, hope you guys found this video informative and entertaining. If you did, please be sure to let me know by hitting that like button, and consider becoming a member and subscribing today, as it really helps me out a lot. Rocket Stone Miners, I'll see you in the next video.